In Hartford Hospital, a 68-year-old retired librarian was about to discover her family's true feelings. What started as Thanksgiving preparation took a shocking turn when she overheard her children celebrating her stroke. Alice Poole wasn't your typical vulnerable patient. For decades, she had built substantial wealth through sacrifice, known for her sharp intellect and devotion to family. When she encountered her children discussing inheritance with excitement, she had no idea she was walking into devastating betrayal. Alice made a vow that would lead to calculated revenge. What began as medical crisis would become strategic retribution. Her family would learn the cost of underestimating a woman's capacity for vengeance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Alice Poole's hands moved with practiced precision as she arranged the last of the autumn chrysanthemums in the crystal vase, the same Waterford crystal her late husband Richard had given her for their 20th anniversary. The November morning light streamed through the kitchen windows of her Connecticut home, casting golden squares across the mahogany table, where 4 generations of Thanksgiving meals had been shared. Everything had to be perfect. It always had been. The turkey sat in the refrigerator, brined since Monday and ready for the oven. The cranberry sauce gleamed ruby red in its serving bowl, made from scratch using her mother's recipe. Sweet potato casserole waited in the refrigerator, topped with those tiny marshmallows Tommy had loved as a child. Even now, at 32, he would look for them first, his eyes lighting up the way they had when he was 7. Alice stepped back to examine her work. The dining room looked exactly as it should, her grandmother's china set for 8, the silver polished to mirror brightness, cloth napkins folded with military precision. She'd been preparing Thanksgiving dinner for 43 years, since Richard's death had made her the sole keeper of family traditions. This year felt different, though. More urgent somehow. The house felt too quiet. It had been months since any of her children had visited without needing something. Money, usually, or her signature on some document. David's real estate ventures seemed to require constant bailouts. Sarah's surgical practice was successful, but she worked such long hours that their conversations had become clipped, efficient exchanges of information. And Tommy, sweet Tommy, who'd always been her favorite, though she'd never admit it aloud, had been distant since his marriage to Jessica 6 months ago. She moved to the kitchen, checking the timer on the bread dough. 2 hours until it would be ready to bake. The familiar rhythm of cooking soothed her nerves. This was what she did best. Creating warmth, bringing people together, making sure everyone felt loved and fed. It was the role she'd chosen, or perhaps it had chosen her, after Richard's heart attack had left her a widow at 49 with 4 children to raise alone. Alice paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden she'd tended for decades. The oak tree Richard had planted when David was born now towered over the house, its branches bare except for a few stubborn leaves clinging to the promise of spring. How many times had she stood in this exact spot, watching her children play beneath those branches? How many scraped knees had she bandaged at this same sink? The memories felt sharper lately, more vivid. Perhaps it was her age, 68 next month, though she felt older some days. Or perhaps it was the growing distance she sensed from her children. The way their eyes would dart to their phones during their increasingly rare visits. The way conversations felt forced, obligatory. She'd worked so hard to give them everything. After Richard's death, she'd taken the modest life insurance payout and invested it carefully, methodically. Her librarian's salary hadn't been much, but she'd stretched every dollar, denied herself vacations and luxuries so they could have music lessons, college educations, help with down payments on their first homes. She'd been proud of their success. David's business ventures, Sarah's medical degree, Tommy's artistic talents, even Linda's social connections that had helped David's career. But success had changed them. Or maybe she'd simply been too naive to see who they really were underneath the polite smiles and dutiful visits. Alice shook her head, dispelling the dark thoughts. Today would be different. Today they would be a family again, gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter like they used to. She would make sure of it. The chrysanthemums needed one final adjustment. She reached for the vase, intending to turn it slightly so the blooms faced the doorway where her children would enter. Her hand trembled, odd, since she'd always had steady hands, a necessity for 30 years of handling fragile library books and precious manuscripts. The trembling intensified. The vase began to slip from her grasp, and she grabbed for it with both hands, her heart rate quickening. Something was wrong. The familiar kitchen seemed to tilt, the golden morning light suddenly too bright, too harsh. "No," she whispered, her voice sounding strange, distant. "Not today." The vase crashed to the floor, crystal shards exploding across the hardwood like fallen stars. Alice tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. Her left side felt heavy, unresponsive. The careful precision of her movements dissolved into chaos as she reached for the kitchen counter, her legs betraying her. The world lurched sideways. Alice's body crumpled, her temple striking the corner of the kitchen island with a sickening thud. She lay on the floor among the broken crystal, her cheek pressed against the cold hardwood, watching the chrysanthemums scatter across the room like autumn leaves. Her mind remained sharp, terrifyingly clear, even as her body refused to obey. She could smell the bread dough rising, hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time with its steady tick. The turkey would spoil if no one found her. The dinner would be ruined. Alice tried to move, to reach for her phone on the counter, but her left arm lay useless at her side. Her mouth felt thick, uncooperative, when she tried to call for help. Only a faint moan escaped her lips. Time stretched like taffy. Minutes or hours passed. She couldn't tell which. The morning light shifted, and she realized with growing panic that no one would think to check on her until this evening, when the family arrived for dinner. By then it might be too late. She thought of Elena, her housekeeper, who wouldn't arrive until Monday, of her neighbor Mrs. Chen, who rarely ventured outside, of the mail carrier who would leave packages on the porch without a second thought. Alice had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to manage everything herself. Now that independence felt like a prison. The sound of her breathing filled the silence, ragged and labored. She tried to focus on the familiar objects around her, the copper pots hanging above the stove, the recipe cards in her own handwriting tucked into the cookbook stand, the photographs on the refrigerator showing decades of family gatherings. These things had been her whole world, the stage on which she'd performed the role of devoted mother and grandmother. But as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, Alice wondered if anyone would truly miss her, or if they would simply be relieved that the burden of caring for an aging parent had been lifted from their shoulders. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of the timer going off, signaling that the bread dough was ready. Even in crisis, she'd timed it perfectly. Elena Vasquez found her 3 hours later, having arrived early to help with the dinner preparations, as she had every Thanksgiving for the past 15 years. Her scream echoed through the house as she dropped her purse and ran to Alice's still form, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. "Please, you have to hurry," Elena sobbed into the phone. "She's not moving. There's blood. Oh God, there's so much blood." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency filling the quiet house with urgency. They worked around the scattered chrysanthemums and broken crystal, their voices calm and measured as they assessed Alice's condition. "Stroke," one of them said quietly to his partner. "Left side paralysis. Possible intracranial bleeding. We need to move fast." Alice drifted in and out of consciousness during the ambulance ride, catching fragments of radio chatter and the steady beep of monitoring equipment. She tried to speak, to tell them about the dinner, about her children who would be arriving soon, but the words wouldn't come. At Hartford Hospital, the emergency department erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the attending physician, took charge immediately, her hands moving with practiced expertise as she examined Alice's pupils, tested her reflexes, and ordered a battery of tests. "Get me a CT scan stat," she called out, "and contact the family. The information says she has 4 children. We need them here." The CT scan revealed the full extent of the damage. A massive stroke had affected the left side of Alice's brain, causing significant paralysis and speech impairment. The fall had resulted in a concussion and several stitches, but the stroke was the primary concern. Dr. Reeves studied the images with a frown. Alice's age worked against her, as did the delay in receiving treatment. The prognosis was guarded at best. David arrived first, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled from the drive from New York. He spoke in hushed tones with Dr. Reeves, his expression grave but somehow unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this call for months. Sarah came next, still in her surgical scrubs, her face a mask of professional composure. She examined her mother's chart with clinical detachment, nodding at the medical terminology, as if Alice were just another patient, rather than the woman who had raised her. Tommy arrived last, his paint-stained clothes and wild hair marking him as different from his siblings. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from tears or the artistic lifestyle he'd adopted. It was hard to tell. Jessica clung to his arm, her pregnant belly just beginning to show, her face pale with worry. Linda swept in wearing her country club finest, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the harsh fluorescent lights. She air-kissed her husband's cheek and assessed the situation with the calculating eye of someone used to managing social crises. They gathered around Alice's bedside, their voices low and respectful, as families do in hospital rooms. To the nursing staff, they appeared to be a devoted family keeping vigil over their beloved matriarch. But Alice, drifting in and out of consciousness, heard something else in their whispered conversations, a note of anticipation, of barely concealed relief. Dr. Reeves delivered the prognosis with gentle professionalism. "The damage is extensive," she explained. "We're looking at significant paralysis on the left side, probably permanent speech difficulties, and the possibility of cognitive impairment. At her age, and given the severity of the stroke, I have to be honest, her chances of meaningful recovery are limited." The family absorbed this information with varying degrees of shock and sorrow. But underneath the appropriate expressions of grief, Alice sensed something else, a current of excitement, of opportunity recognized. As the afternoon wore on, and Alice's conditions stabilized, the family settled into the rhythm of a hospital vigil. They took turns sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, speaking in the encouraging tones that family members use with the critically ill. But Alice, trapped in her damaged body but with her mind still sharp, began to understand that their vigil was not about hope for her recovery. It was about waiting for her to die. The realization came slowly, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. Small comments, meaningful glances, the way they spoke about her in the third person even when she was obviously conscious. They were already planning for a future without her, already calculating how her absence would solve their problems. As evening approached and the hospital corridors grew quiet, Alice lay in her bed listening to the steady beep of the monitors and the soft conversations of her children. The Thanksgiving dinner she'd spent days preparing would spoil in her refrigerator. The table she'd set with such care would remain empty. But Alice Poole was not done yet. Something had been awakened in her by the betrayal she sensed. Something harder and more dangerous than the loving mother they thought they knew. They expected her to fade away quietly, to slip into the role of grateful invalid, eventually dying and leaving them her carefully accumulated wealth. They had severely underestimated her. As the night deepened and her family prepared to leave for the evening, Alice made a silent promise to herself. She would survive this. She would recover. And she would make sure that those who had celebrated her suffering would learn the true cost of their betrayal. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time until the real battle could begin. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time until the real battle could begin. Alice lay motionless in her hospital bed, her breathing shallow and measured, her eyes closed to mere slits. To anyone watching, she appeared unconscious, lost in the depths of post-stroke recovery. But behind her seemingly peaceful facade, her mind remained razor-sharp, cataloging every sound, every whispered word, every telling silence. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the sterile room. Alice had been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours, her body fighting to heal while her mind processed the fragments of conversations she'd overheard. Something in her children's voices had changed since yesterday, a subtle shift in tone that her librarian's ear, trained to detect the nuances of human speech, couldn't ignore. She heard footsteps in the hallway, the familiar cadence of expensive shoes against linoleum. David's voice carried clearly through the partially open door as he spoke to someone, probably a nurse or doctor, his tone respectful, concerned, the perfect grieving son. "Yes, we understand the prognosis," he was saying. "We just want to make sure she's comfortable." Alice's heart clenched. The word comfortable, in medical settings, had implications that went far beyond physical ease. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her breathing steady, as more footsteps approached her room. "Is she awake?" Sarah's voice, crisp and professional even in whispered tones. "Hard to tell," David replied. "The nurse said she's been mostly unresponsive since last night." Alice felt the familiar presence of her eldest son as he moved closer to her bedside. Through her barely open eyes, she could see his face, still handsome at 45, but marked by the stress lines that came from years of poor financial decisions and mounting debt. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "How long do you think?" Linda's voice joined the conversation, pitched low but carrying clearly in the quiet room. "The doctor said it could be days, could be weeks," Sarah answered with clinical detachment. "At her age, with this level of damage." The sentence hung unfinished, but Alice heard the implication clearly. Her daughter, the neurosurgeon, was essentially delivering her death sentence with the same emotional distance she might use to discuss a stranger's case. More footsteps. Tommy's voice, younger and less certain than his siblings. "I still can't believe this happened. Yesterday she was fine, getting everything ready for dinner, and now..." "Now what?" David's voice carried an edge of impatience. "Tommy, we've been expecting this for years. Mom's not young anymore, and living alone in that big house. Honestly, I'm surprised it took this long." Alice's breath caught in her throat. The casual way he dismissed her independence, her vitality, as if her stroke had been inevitable, almost welcome. She forced herself to remain still, to keep listening. "David's right," Linda chimed in, her voice carrying that particular brand of social climbing righteousness that had always grated on Alice's nerves. At her age, this kind of thing was bound to happen. In some ways, it's a blessing. A blessing. The word hit Alice like a physical blow. Her own daughter-in-law was calling her stroke a blessing. "Linda," Tommy's voice held a note of protest, weak but genuine. That's not..." "Not what?" Linda's tone sharpened. "Not honest. Tommy, your mother has been declining for months. We've all seen it. The way she repeats stories, forgets things, gets confused about dates. This stroke is just... well, it's nature taking its course." Alice's mind reeled. She hadn't been declining. She'd been sharper than ever, managing her investments with the same precision she'd brought to organizing library collections. The stories Linda claimed she repeated were family histories, memories she'd been trying to share with grandchildren who might never hear them otherwise. The confusion about dates had happened exactly once, when she'd mixed up David's birthday with his anniversary, and she'd corrected herself immediately. But Linda was rewriting history, painting her as a doddering old woman whose stroke was somehow merciful. "The timing is actually perfect," David said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I mean, obviously it's tragic, but from a practical standpoint. Jessica's pregnant, Tommy needs financial support. My business is finally turning around, and Sarah's practice is expanding. Mom's estate could really help all of us move forward." Estate? They were discussing her estate as if she were already dead. Alice felt Sarah move closer to the bed, her presence clinical and assessing. "The brain scans show significant damage," she said quietly. "Even if she survives, she'll need full-time care. The house will have to be sold, her assets liquidated to pay for medical expenses." Unless what?" Linda asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Unless she doesn't make it through the recovery process," Sarah finished. "Which, given her age and the severity of the stroke, is quite possible. Maybe even probable." The silence that followed was deafening. Alice could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the blood pressure cuff tightening and releasing on her arm. Her own daughter, a doctor sworn to preserve life, was essentially hoping for her death. "How long before we know?" David asked. "The next few days are critical," Sarah replied. "If she's going to recover any meaningful function, we'll see signs soon. If not, we can start making arrangements," Linda finished. "The funeral home, the estate lawyers, all of that. It's better to be prepared." Alice's mind reeled with the implications. They weren't just discussing her death. They were planning for it, hoping for it, seeing it as the solution to their financial problems. The woman who had raised them, sacrificed for them, loved them unconditionally, was being treated like a burden to be disposed of. "I've already spoken to James Morrison," David continued. "Informally, of course. He says the will is straightforward, equal shares to all four of us, with some provisions for the grandchildren. The house alone is worth at least $2 million, and that's not counting her investment portfolio." "How much do you think she has?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible. "Enough," David replied. "More than enough. That librarian's pension and Social Security were nothing, but she was smart with money. All those years of pinching pennies, investing every spare dollar. It adds up." Alice felt tears threatening behind her closed eyelids. They knew about her financial acumen, had benefited from it countless times, but they spoke about her careful stewardship as if it were merely a convenient accident. "The best part is, there won't be any estate taxes if she dies naturally," Linda added. "Heart attack, stroke complications, whatever. Clean and simple." "She's not gonna die." Jessica's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Alice hadn't heard her youngest daughter-in-law enter the room, but her presence was immediately felt. "I'm sorry, but listening to you all talk about Alice like she's already gone. It's disgusting." "Jessica, you don't understand," David began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he wanted to dismiss someone's opinion. "I understand perfectly," Jessica shot back. "I understand that your mother spent yesterday morning preparing a Thanksgiving feast for a family that's already calculating how to divide up her belongings. I understand that she's lying here fighting for her life while you're discussing funeral arrangements." "Be realistic, Jessica." Sarah's voice was cold, clinical. "The damage is extensive. Even if she survives, she'll never be the same. She'll need round-the-clock care, special facilities, constant medical supervision. Do you have any idea what that costs?" "So we figure it out," Jessica replied. "Families do that. They don't just give up." "Easy for you to say," Linda's voice dripped with condescension. "You haven't been dealing with this for years. You haven't watched her slowly decline, haven't had to manage her finances, haven't had to listen to the same stories over and over again. You married into this family 6 months ago, Jessica. You don't get to lecture us about what's best for our mother." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Alice's monitors. She could feel the tension crackling between her family members, could sense Jessica's isolation as she stood against the united front of her children's callousness. "I'm going to get some coffee," Jessica said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "When I come back, maybe we can talk about your mother like she's a human being, instead of a stock portfolio." Her footsteps receded down the hallway, leaving Alice alone with her 3 children and Linda. The silence stretched until David spoke again. "She'll come around," he said dismissively. "Pregnancy hormones make women emotional. Once the baby comes, she'll understand the practical realities." "The practical reality is that Mom's suffering is finally over," Linda said quietly. "She's been lonely since Dad died, struggling to maintain that huge house, trying to hold on to a role that doesn't exist anymore. This stroke, it's actually merciful. She won't have to face the slow decline, the nursing homes, the indignity of it all." Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. Linda was rewriting her entire life, painting her as a tragic figure, whose stroke was somehow a kindness. The woman who had been planning dinner parties and managing complex investments just days ago was being transformed into a pathetic invalid who needed to be put out of her misery. "I just hope it's quick," Tommy said softly. "I don't want her to suffer." "She won't," Sarah replied with professional certainty. "If she doesn't improve in the next few days, we can discuss options. Comfort care, pain management, making sure she's peaceful. Options. Alice knew exactly what her daughter meant. They were discussing letting her die, withdrawing treatment, allowing, quote, nature to take its course. The neurosurgeon who had sworn to preserve life was ready to let her own mother slip away. "I'll handle the legal side," David said. "Morrison can have the estate paperwork ready within days. We'll need to move quickly on the house. The market's good right now, and we don't want to let it sit empty." "What about her things?" Linda asked. "All that china? The jewelry? The books?" "Some of it might be valuable." "We'll have it appraised," David replied. "Split anything valuable. Donate the rest. The important thing is to liquidate everything efficiently." They were dividing up her possessions like vultures picking at a carcass. The china her grandmother had given her, the jewelry Richard had chosen with such care, the books that had been her companions for decades, all of it reduced to monetary value to be split efficiently. Alice felt something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest. This wasn't grief or shock anymore. This was rage. Pure, focused, and utterly consuming. These people had pretended to love her, had accepted her money and her help and her unconditional support, all while waiting for her to die so they could claim their inheritance. "I need to get back to the hospital," Sarah said. "I have surgery in 2 hours, but I'll keep monitoring her condition and I'll make sure the attending physician understands our preferences." "What preferences?" Tommy asked. "That we want her to be comfortable," Sarah replied smoothly. "That we don't want any extraordinary measures, any prolonged suffering. If her condition deteriorates, we want to let her go peacefully." Alice's blood turned to ice. Her daughter was going to influence her medical care, was going to ensure that every decision favored letting her die rather than fighting for her recovery. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing was prepared to let her own mother slip away. "I think that's wise," David said. "Mom wouldn't want to be kept alive artificially. She always said she wanted to die with dignity." Another lie. Alice had never said any such thing. She'd been planning to live to 100, to see her grandchildren grow up, to continue building her legacy. But David was creating a fictional version of her wishes to justify their abandonment. "I'll stay with her tonight," Linda offered. "Keep vigil, make sure she's not alone." It's what she would have wanted. The hypocrisy was staggering. Linda, who had just called her stroke a blessing, was now volunteering to play the role of devoted daughter-in-law. The performance was for the hospital staff, Alice realized, to maintain the appearance of a caring family while they waited for her to die. "That's thoughtful," David said. "Tommy, you and Jessica can take tomorrow. Sarah, you'll monitor the medical side. We'll rotate shifts so there's always someone here." They were organizing a death watch, coordinating their presence to ensure they appeared devoted while hoping for her demise. Alice had never felt so utterly alone, so completely betrayed. "I should go," Tommy said quietly. "Jessica's probably upset, and the baby—" "Handle your wife," David's voice carried a warning. "We can't afford to have her causing problems. If she can't accept the reality of the situation, maybe she shouldn't be here." "She's pregnant with your nephew," Tommy protested weakly. "Which is exactly why she needs to understand what's best for this family," Linda replied. "That baby is going to need financial security, college funds, a stable future. Alice's estate can provide that. But not if Jessica's guilt makes us do something stupid like bankrupting ourselves on medical bills for a woman who's already gone." Alice felt the final pieces of her heart breaking. They were using her unborn grandchild as justification for their callousness, claiming that her death would benefit the baby she would never get to hold. The conversation began to wind down as her children prepared to leave. They made the appropriate noises about hoping for the best, about being there for each other, about honoring her wishes. But Alice heard the truth beneath their words. They were hoping for her death, planning for it, and they would do everything in their power to ensure it happened quickly and quietly. As their footsteps faded down the hallway, Alice lay in her hospital bed, her body broken but her mind burning with crystalline clarity. They thought she was finished, thought she was just another elderly stroke victim who would fade away conveniently. They had no idea that their conversation had awakened something in her that was far more dangerous than the loving mother they thought they knew. Alice Poole had spent her entire adult life sacrificing for her family, putting their needs above her own, building a legacy she thought they would cherish. Now she understood that her legacy meant nothing to them beyond its monetary value. Her love had been wasted on people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. But they had made a fatal error. They had underestimated her. Alice began to plan. She would recover. Not just survive, but thrive. She would return to her life stronger and more focused than ever before. And she would make sure that every person who had celebrated her stroke, who had planned for her death, who had reduced her to a line item in an estate plan, would pay for their betrayal. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time until her revenge could begin. Alice Poole was far from finished. In fact, she was just getting started. Christmas was only a month away. It would be a holiday her family would never forget. Christmas was only a month away. It would be a holiday her family would never forget. Alice lay in the darkness of her hospital room, the weight of her children's betrayal settling into her bones like winter frost. But instead of the crushing despair she might have expected, she felt something else entirely, a cold, sharp clarity that cut through the fog of her physical pain. The monitors continued their rhythmic beeping, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to echo her newfound resolve. Alice had always prided herself on being a woman of action, someone who solved problems rather than wallowing in them. Her children had given her a problem, their complete lack of love or respect for the woman who had sacrificed everything for them. Now she would solve it. The first challenge was recovery. Not the modest, assisted recovery her family expected, but a complete restoration of her faculties. Alice began to catalog what she knew about her condition. The stroke had affected her left side, causing paralysis and speech difficulties. But her mind, the weapon she would need most, remained sharp as ever. Over the next 3 days, Alice performed a careful balancing act. When the medical staff examined her, she showed just enough progress to avoid being written off entirely, but not enough to raise hopes of full recovery. She learned to slur her words convincingly while speaking clearly in her mind, to move her right hand with deliberate clumsiness while secretly testing her returning dexterity. The breakthrough came when she met Robert Martinez. "Good morning, Mrs. Poole." The voice was warm, professional, tinged with a slight accent that spoke of hard-won experience. "I'm Bobby Martinez, your physical therapist. I'm here to help you get stronger." Alice opened her eyes to find a man in his early 40s, compact and muscular, with kind eyes and calloused hands. There was something in his manner that immediately set him apart from the other hospital staff. He looked at her as if she were a person, not just a medical case. "I know this is scary," Bobby continued, adjusting the bed rails with practiced efficiency. "But I want you to know that I believe in your potential for recovery. I've worked with stroke patients for 15 years, and I've learned never to underestimate what the human spirit can accomplish." Alice felt something crack in her chest, not the brittle breaking of betrayal, but the first warm stirring of hope she'd experienced since her stroke. Here was someone who saw her as more than a problem to be managed, or an inheritance to be claimed. "Let's start simple," Bobby said, gently lifting her left arm. "I'm going to move your arm through some range of motion exercises. Don't try to help yet, just let me do the work." As Bobby worked with quiet competence, Alice studied his face. She saw something there that her own children had lacked. Genuine compassion, professional dedication, and the kind of respectful determination that came from truly caring about his patients' well-being. "Your daughter mentioned you were a librarian," Bobby said conversationally as he worked. 30 years at the Hartford Public Library, right? That's impressive. I bet you helped a lot of people find exactly what they needed." Alice's heart clenched. Sarah had mentioned her career, but only in passing, only as background information for the medical staff. Bobby spoke about her work with genuine interest, as if her life had value beyond her current medical condition. "I grew up in the library," Bobby continued. "My mom worked 2 jobs, so I spent every afternoon there from age 8 to 18. Librarians saved my life, honestly. They saw potential in a kid from East Hartford when nobody else did." Alice tried to speak, managed a weak "thank you," and was surprised to hear Bobby's face light up with genuine pleasure. There we go. That's excellent, Mrs. Poole. Speech recovery often comes in stages, but you're already showing progress. Progress. Not decline, not futility, but progress. Alice felt her resolve crystallizing further. This man believed in her recovery, not because he wanted something from her, but because he genuinely cared about her well-being. Over the following days, Bobby became Alice's anchor in the storm of her family's false concern. During their therapy sessions, she carefully tested the boundaries of her recovery, pushing herself harder than anyone suspected, while maintaining the facade of limited improvement. "Your grip strength is increasing," Bobby observed during their fourth session, noting her progress on his chart. "That's a very good sign. The neural pathways are reconnecting." Alice squeezed his hand slightly, a gesture that could be interpreted as gratitude, but was actually a test of her returning strength. Bobby squeezed back gently, his touch conveying encouragement without condescension. "I want to tell you something," Bobby said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone. "I've been doing this for a long time, and I can see when someone has fight left in them. You have that fight, Mrs. Poole. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Alice met his eyes directly, allowed him to see a flash of the sharp intelligence that still burned within her. Bobby nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding passing between them without words. The next significant development came when Elena Vasquez arrived. Alice heard her housekeeper's voice in the hallway before she saw her, Elena arguing with someone at the nurse's station in rapid-fire Spanish, her tone indicating she was not pleased with the responses she was receiving. "I don't care about visiting hours," Elena was saying as she entered the room, her voice switching to accented English. "I have been taking care of this woman for 20 years. She is my family." Elena stopped short when she saw Alice in the hospital bed, her weathered face crumpling with emotion. "Ay, Dios mío, señora. What have they done to you?" Alice felt tears threatening for the first time since her stroke. Elena's grief was genuine, untainted by calculation or self-interest. Here was someone who truly mourned her suffering, who saw her as irreplaceable rather than as a burden. "The doctors, they say you might not." Elena's voice broke. "But I know you, señora. You are stronger than they think. You have to be." Alice managed to whisper Elena's name, and the housekeeper immediately moved to her bedside, taking her hand with infinite gentleness. "I am here," Elena said simply. "Whatever you need, I am here." Over the next several visits, Elena became Alice's connection to the outside world. She brought news from the house. How the neighbors had been asking about Alice, how the garden was faring, how the mail was piling up. But more importantly, Elena brought information about Alice's children. "Mr. David, he came by the house yesterday," Elena reported during one visit, her voice carefully neutral. "He was looking through your office, asking about papers." Alice's blood chilled. David had no legitimate reason to be in her office, no right to examine her personal documents, unless he was preparing for her death, cataloging her assets for easier distribution. "He asked me about your safe," Elena continued. "Said he needed to know where important papers were kept, in case of emergency." Alice squeezed Elena's hand, a signal they had developed over the years. Elena leaned closer, understanding that Alice wanted to communicate something important. "The safe," Alice managed to whisper. "Combination. Changed." Elena's eyes widened. "When, señora?" "Last month." Alice struggled with the words. "New will." Elena sat back, processing this information. After 20 years of working together, she understood Alice's careful nature, her attention to detail. If Alice had changed her will recently, it meant she had been planning something. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked quietly. Alice looked toward the door, ensuring they were alone, then whispered, "Watch them. Listen." Elena nodded grimly. "I understand." The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Jessica appeared in the doorway, her pregnancy beginning to show more prominently, her face pale with what Alice recognized as genuine distress. "I'm sorry to bother you, Alice." Jessica said softly, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I know you're tired, but I needed to see you. To talk to you." Alice opened her eyes fully, allowing Jessica to see her alertness. "I need you to know that not all of us feel the way some people do about your condition," Jessica continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I keep thinking about Thanksgiving morning, how excited you were about dinner, how hard you worked to make everything perfect for us." Alice felt her heart twist. Jessica was the only one who remembered her excitement, who saw her stroke as a tragedy rather than a convenience. "I'm scared, Alice," Jessica whispered. "I'm scared about the baby, about Tommy, about what's happening to this family. And I'm scared that when you're gone, there won't be anyone left who knows how to love without conditions." Alice reached out with her good hand, managing to touch Jessica's fingers. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if you can understand me," Jessica continued, "but I want you to know that I see you. I see the woman who spent 40 years building a life for her family, who turned a modest income into something substantial through sheer determination and sacrifice. I see the mother who never missed a birthday, never failed to show up when someone needed her." Alice squeezed Jessica's hand, tears sliding down her own cheeks. "I love you," Jessica said simply, "and I'm not going to let them forget who you are." As Jessica left, Alice felt something fundamental shift inside her. The rage was still there, cold and sharp and utterly focused. But now it was tempered by something else, a recognition that not everyone in her family was lost, that there was still something worth protecting. Her revenge would need to be precise, surgical. She would destroy those who had betrayed her, but she would protect the innocent. Jessica and the baby she carried represented the future Alice had always fought for, the reason she had sacrificed so much. Alice closed her eyes and began to plan in earnest. Christmas was 3 weeks away. She would need to accelerate her recovery, to convince the medical staff that she was ready to go home. She would need Elena's help, Bobby's unknowing assistance, and access to her carefully guarded resources. Most of all, she would need to become someone her children had never imagined she could be, not the selfless mother who had always put their needs first, but a woman who had learned that sometimes love required the courage to let people face the consequences of their choices. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking time until her transformation was complete. Alice Poole was about to teach her family a lesson they would never forget, that underestimating a woman's capacity for both love and vengeance was a mistake that could destroy everything they held dear. The real game was just beginning. The real game was just beginning. Alice spent the following week carefully orchestrating her recovery, showing just enough progress to convince the medical staff she was ready for discharge, while maintaining the appearance of limited capability for her family. The performance required precision. Too much improvement would raise suspicions. Too little would keep her trapped in the hospital where she couldn't execute her plans. During her therapy sessions with Bobby, Alice pushed herself harder than anyone suspected. While appearing to struggle with basic motor functions, she was actually testing her returning strength, cataloging what she could do versus what she pretended to be unable to do. "Your speech is improving remarkably," Bobby observed during their morning session, genuine pleasure in his voice. "The neural pathways are reconnecting faster than the doctors predicted." Alice managed what appeared to be a labored response. "Feel stronger." "You are stronger," Bobby confirmed, making notes on his chart. "Your grip strength is approaching normal levels, your balance is improving, and your cognitive responses are sharp. You're going to surprise a lot of people, Mrs. Poole." If only he knew how much she intended to surprise them, Alice thought. Bobby's encouragement was genuine, untainted by ulterior motives. He saw her recovery as a triumph of human spirit over adversity, not knowing that her renewed strength would be weaponized against her own family. "I think we should discuss discharge planning," Bobby continued. "You're going to need some assistance at home initially, but your progress suggests you'll regain most of your independence." Alice nodded carefully. Independence was exactly what she needed. Freedom to move, to plan, to execute her revenge without medical supervision or family interference. Elena's visits became increasingly important during this phase. The housekeeper had become Alice's intelligence network, reporting on her children's activities with the observational skills of someone who had spent decades managing a household. "Mr. David came by again yesterday," Elena reported during one visit, her voice low. "This time he brought Mrs. Linda. They were in your office for over an hour, looking through files." Alice's jaw tightened. They were conducting a full inventory of her assets, preparing for her death, like vultures circling carrion. "Mrs. Linda, she was very interested in your jewelry box," Elena continued. "She kept asking about the diamond necklace, the one Mr. Richard gave you for your anniversary. She said she wanted to make sure it was, quote, properly appraised for estate purposes." Alice's blood ran cold. That necklace was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of her marriage, of the love she and Richard had shared. Linda's interest in it was purely mercenary, reducing a precious memory to a line item in an estate valuation. "And Dr. Sarah?" Alice managed to ask. Elena's expression darkened. "She came by with some papers. Said she needed to review your medical power of attorney, make sure everything was in order for your, quote, care decisions." Alice understood immediately. Sarah was positioning herself to make medical decisions on Alice's behalf, decisions that would prioritize comfort over recovery, death over life. Her own daughter was preparing to pull the plug if Alice's recovery didn't proceed according to their preferred timeline. "Elena," Alice whispered, "need lawyer." Elena leaned closer. "Mr. Morrison?" Alice nodded. James Morrison had been her attorney for over 20 years, had helped her navigate the complexities of estate planning and investment management. More importantly, he was one of the few people who understood the full scope of her wealth and the careful planning that had gone into building it. "I will call him," Elena promised. "But, Signora, are you sure? If your children find out—" "They already decided," Alice managed, her voice gaining strength from her anger. "My turn." Elena nodded grimly. She had worked for the Poole family long enough to understand the dynamics, to see how Alice's children had changed from grateful recipients of her generosity to entitled heirs impatient for their inheritance. The next day brought an unexpected development. Alice was pretending to nap when she heard David's voice in the hallway, speaking to someone in the urgent tones of a man under pressure. "I don't care what the contract says," David was saying. "I need more time. My mother's situation has created some complications." Alice strained to hear more, recognizing the desperation in her son's voice. Through her barely open eyes, she could see him pacing near the nurse's station, his phone pressed to his ear. 2 weeks, he continued. "Just give me 2 weeks to sort this out. Once the estate is settled, you'll have your money." Estate? Alice's blood chilled as she realized David was using her anticipated death as collateral for his debts. He had borrowed money against his inheritance, counting on her demise to save his failing business. "I understand the interest rate," David said, his voice strained. "But I'm good for it. The house alone is worth $2 million, and that's conservative. My mother has investments, bonds, a whole portfolio." Alice lay perfectly still, cataloging every word. David wasn't just hoping for her death, he was financially dependent on it. His creditors were circling, and her estate was the only thing standing between him and complete financial ruin. The conversation continued for several more minutes, revealing the full scope of David's desperation. He had borrowed heavily against future inheritance, had made promises he couldn't keep without her death. Alice's stroke hadn't just been convenient, it had been his salvation. When James Morrison arrived that afternoon, Alice was ready for him. The attorney was a man in his 70s, distinguished and careful, with the kind of old-school professionalism that had served Alice well over the years. "Alice," he said softly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "I'm so sorry about what's happened. When Elena called, I came as quickly as I could." Alice had always respected James's directness, his ability to cut through emotional complications to reach practical solutions. Now she needed that skill more than ever. "James," she managed, her speech clearer than it had been with anyone except Elena. "Need to change Will. James's eyebrows rose slightly. Change it how? Alice had spent days planning this conversation, organizing her thoughts into the most efficient possible communication. David. Stealing. Sarah. Wants me. Dead. Linda. Counting. My jewelry. James leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Are you certain about these accusations, Alice? They're your children. Heard them, Alice said, her voice gaining strength from her conviction. Celebrated. My stroke. Called it. Blessing. James's face hardened. In his decades of practice, he had seen families torn apart by greed, had watched inheritance battles destroy relationships and corrupt character. But he had always believed the Pooles were different, that Alice's careful nurturing had created a family bound by love rather than money. What do you want to do? He asked quietly. Alice had been planning this moment for days, considering every angle, every possible consequence. New will, punish, betrayers, protect, innocent. Jessica, James said, understanding immediately. And the baby. Alice nodded. Tommy? Maybe. He's weak, not evil. James pulled out his tablet, preparing to take notes. What specifically do you want to change? Alice's eyes grew cold, her voice stronger as she outlined her plan. David gets nothing. Sarah gets nothing. Linda gets nothing. They want me dead? They get what they deserve. And your assets? Trust. For Jessica. For baby. Tommy. Small allowance. If he proves himself. James made careful notes, his expression thoughtful. This is a significant change, Alice. Are you certain you want to do this while you're recovering from a stroke? The family could contest it, claim you weren't competent. Alice smiled for the first time since her stroke, an expression that would have chilled her children if they had seen it. Let them try. You've known me 20 years. Am I competent? James looked into her eyes, saw the sharp intelligence that had always defined Alice Poole, the strategic mind that had turned a modest income into substantial wealth. You're one of the most competent people I've ever known. Then do it. Tonight. James nodded slowly. I'll need to bring some documents by tomorrow. We'll need witnesses, signatures, all the proper legal safeguards. Elena, Alice said, and Bobby, my therapist, they'll witness. As James prepared to leave, Alice called him back. James, one more thing. David, borrowing against inheritance. Find out how much, who he owes. James's expression grew even more serious. You want to know the full scope of his financial obligations? Want to know how desperate he is, Alice replied. Desperate people make mistakes. After James left, Alice lay in her bed, feeling more energized than she had since her stroke. For the first time in days, she had taken action rather than simply enduring. The new will was just the beginning. She had weeks of planning ahead, strategies to develop, resources to marshal. Elena arrived that evening with updates from the house. The mail is piling up, she reported. Bills, investment statements, letters from the bank. Mr. David asked me to bring them to him. Don't, Alice said firmly. Bring them. To me. Tomorrow. Elena nodded, understanding. What about the Christmas decorations? Mrs. Linda asked me to put them up early this year. She said it would be, quote, appropriate for the season. Alice's blood chilled. Linda was decorating her house for Christmas, preparing for a celebration that would mark Alice's death. The woman was planning to play hostess in Alice's home, using her possessions to create a festive atmosphere for the family gathering where they would mourn her passing and celebrate their inheritance. No decorations, Alice said coldly. Tell her, I'm not ready. Elena smiled grimly. With pleasure, Señora. As the evening settled around them, Alice began to outline her strategy in earnest. She would need to accelerate her recovery, to convince the medical staff she was ready for discharge. She would need to return home in time for Christmas, to be there when her family gathered to celebrate what they assumed would be her final holiday season. But this Christmas would be different from what they expected. Instead of saying goodbye to a dying woman, they would meet the real Alice Poole, the woman who had spent 40 years building an empire through careful planning and strategic thinking, who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love was allowing people to face the consequences of their betrayal. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking time until her transformation was complete. Alice Poole was about to teach her family that underestimating a woman's capacity for both love and vengeance was a mistake that could destroy everything they thought they knew about their future. Christmas was 2 weeks away. She would be ready. Christmas was 2 weeks away. She would be ready. The discharge papers were signed on a crisp December morning, with Alice maintaining her carefully crafted performance of limited recovery. Dr. Reeves spoke in measured tones about the need for assistance, about realistic expectations, about the importance of not pushing too hard too fast. Alice nodded dutifully, leaning heavily on her walker while secretly calculating how quickly she could abandon the prop once she was home. Her family surrounded her with appropriate displays of concern. David adjusting her wheelchair, Sarah reviewing medication schedules with clinical precision, Linda fussing over the arrangements Elena had made at the house. "We've set up the guest room downstairs," Linda explained, her voice carrying the false sweetness Alice had learned to recognize. "No need for you to navigate the stairs until you're stronger." Alice managed a weak smile of gratitude while inwardly seething. Linda was keeping her confined to the ground floor, limiting her access to her office, her safe, her private sanctuary. The woman was already acting like the lady of the house, making decisions about Alice's own home. The drive through Hartford's affluent neighborhoods felt surreal. Alice pressed her face to the window, drinking in the familiar sights of the community she'd called home for 30 years. The houses were decorated for Christmas, wreaths on doors, lights strung along roof lines, the kind of seasonal warmth that had once filled her with joy. Now it felt like a mockery. Her neighbors had no idea that the woman they'd known as a devoted mother and grandmother was returning home to wage war against her own family. Elena was waiting at the front door, her face carefully neutral as she helped Alice from the car. But Alice caught the slight nod, the knowing look in her housekeeper's eyes. Everything was ready. "The house looks wonderful," Tommy said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "Elena's been taking such good care of everything." Alice squeezed his hand weakly, allowing herself a moment of genuine affection for her youngest son. Tommy's betrayal had hurt the most because she'd believed he was different. But perhaps there was still hope for redemption, still a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of her family. Inside, Alice took in the subtle changes. The furniture had been rearranged to accommodate her supposed limitations, with a hospital bed installed in the guest room and grab bars added to the bathroom. But more telling were the things that were missing. Family photographs had been moved, valuable items relocated, as if the house was already being prepared for new ownership. "I hope you don't mind," Linda said, gesturing toward the living room. "I took the liberty of having a few pieces appraised. For insurance purposes, of course." "Of course." Alice's jaw tightened as she saw the empty spaces where her grandmother's vases had once stood, the missing artwork from the hallway walls. Linda hadn't just been planning her funeral. She'd been conducting a full inventory of her inheritance. "The Christmas decorations," Alice managed to say, noticing the boxes stacked in the corner. Linda wanted. "Oh, that can wait," Linda said quickly. "You need to rest. Get settled. We'll worry about decorating later." But Alice could see the hunger in Linda's eyes, the way she looked at the house as if it were already hers. The woman was restraining herself, maintaining the appearance of appropriate concern while mentally redecorating Alice's home. As evening approached and her family prepared to leave, Alice felt the weight of her performance. She had to appear grateful for their care, dependent on their support, while secretly planning their destruction. The exhaustion was real, but not from her stroke. It came from the constant vigilance required to maintain her facade. "I'll stay tonight," Jessica offered, her genuine concern a stark contrast to the calculated care of the others. "Make sure you're comfortable." Alice nodded gratefully, knowing that Jessica's presence would provide both comfort and protection. With her daughter-in-law there, she could begin the real work of her recovery, without fear of surveillance or interference. After the others left, Alice allowed herself to drop some of her pretense. She walked more steadily, spoke more clearly, let Jessica see glimpses of the woman she truly was. "You're stronger than you're letting on," Jessica observed quietly. Alice met her eyes directly. "Some things require strategy." Jessica nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "What can I do to help?" Alice smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd felt since her stroke. "Just be yourself. Be honest. In this family, that's revolutionary." As Jessica settled in for the night, Alice lay in her temporary bed, staring at the ceiling of her own home. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. She would start with small actions, subtle manipulations that would appear innocent while laying the groundwork for her family's destruction. Christmas was 11 days away. By then, her children would learn the true cost of their betrayal. Christmas was 11 days away. By then, her children would learn the true cost of their betrayal. Alice woke the next morning to find Jessica already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. The sight filled Alice with a bittersweet warmth. Here was the daughter she'd never had, the one who saw nurturing as natural rather than strategic. "How did you sleep?" Jessica asked, her genuine concern evident in every word. "Better than I have in weeks," Alice replied, allowing more strength into her voice than she would have with her own children. "Thank you for staying." Jessica poured coffee into Alice's favorite mug, the one with the faded library logo that her children had always mocked as beneath their mother's status. But Jessica had noticed which cup Alice preferred, had paid attention to the small details that revealed who she truly was. "I called Tommy this morning," Jessica said carefully. "He's worried about you, but he's also stressed. About money, about the baby, about everything." Alice nodded, understanding the subtext. Tommy's financial dependence on her made him vulnerable to his siblings' influence. But his genuine love for Jessica created a conflict that might be exploited. "And David?" Alice asked, testing the waters. Jessica's expression darkened. "He's been calling Tommy constantly, asking about your condition, about how you're managing at home. He seems very interested in your recovery timeline." Alice's blood ran cold. David was monitoring her progress, calculating how long she might linger before dying naturally. His creditors were closing in, and her estate was the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. After Jessica left to tend her own responsibilities, Alice began her work in earnest. Elena arrived precisely at 9, as she had every weekday for 20 years, but her usual warm greeting was replaced by a grim nod of understanding. "The papers you wanted," Elena said quietly, handing Alice a manila envelope. "All the mail from the past 2 weeks, including some very interesting letters." Alice opened the envelope with trembling hands that had nothing to do with her stroke. Inside were bank statements, investment reports, and several letters that made her blood freeze. David had been forging her signature, accessing accounts that required her written authorization. The evidence was clear. He had been stealing from her for months, using her stroke as cover for increasingly desperate measures. "There's more," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found this in your office wastebasket." She handed Alice a crumpled piece of paper, a draft letter to an estate attorney, written in Linda's distinctive handwriting. The letter inquired about expediting probate proceedings, about the possibility of challenging a will if the deceased showed signs of cognitive decline before death. Alice's hands shook with rage. Linda wasn't just planning her funeral. She was preparing to steal her legacy, to challenge any will that didn't favor her husband's financial interests. "Elena," Alice said, her voice deadly calm, "I need you to make some phone calls." Over the next hour, Alice systematically began to dismantle her children's lives. The first call was to David's largest creditor, a man named Vincent Torino, who had been calling the house daily since Alice's stroke. Alice's voice was steady as she explained that she was very much alive, that her estate was not available as collateral, and that any loans made against her future death were null and void. The second call was to the Connecticut State Medical Board. Alice's voice trembled with carefully calculated emotion as she reported concerns about a surgeon who had been making treatment decisions for family members, who had been discussing patient prognoses with non-medical personnel, who had been prioritizing financial considerations over patient care. The third call was to the Hartford Country Club, where Linda had been boasting about her upcoming inheritance and making plans for an elaborate Christmas celebration at her new home. Alice's voice was perfectly pitched as she explained that reports of her death had been greatly exaggerated, that any reservations or plans made in her name were unauthorized, and that the club should be aware of fraudulent activity. By noon, Alice's carefully orchestrated campaign was beginning to bear fruit. Elena reported that David's phone had been ringing constantly, that she had seen him through the window of his office building, pacing frantically as he spoke to someone who was clearly not pleased with whatever David was telling them. Mrs. Linda called, Elena added with barely concealed satisfaction. She wanted to know if you were comfortable and when you might be ready for visitors. She sounded upset. Alice smiled grimly. Linda's social humiliation was just beginning. The country club gossip network was more efficient than any communication system, and word would spread quickly that the grieving daughter-in-law had been caught planning celebrations for someone who wasn't dead. The afternoon brought Sarah's arrival, her usual clinical composure replaced by barely controlled agitation. She swept into the house with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, her medical bag in hand, as if Alice were still her patient. "Mother, I need to examine you," Sarah announced without preamble. "Your discharge was premature. I'm concerned about your cognitive function." Alice understood immediately. Sarah had received word of the medical board inquiry and was attempting to document cognitive decline, to build a case that any recent decisions Alice had made were invalid. "I feel fine," Alice said carefully, maintaining her facade of weakness while allowing steel to creep into her voice. "Better than I have in weeks." Sarah's examination was thorough but increasingly frustrated. Alice's vital signs were strong, her reflexes normal, her cognitive responses sharp. There was no medical evidence of decline, no documentation that would support a claim of incompetence. "I'm recommending additional tests," Sarah said finally. "CT scans, neurological evaluations, psychiatric assessments. We need to be thorough." "No," Alice said quietly. Sarah's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not your patient, Sarah. I'm your mother, and I'm perfectly capable of making my own medical decisions." For the first time since her stroke, Alice saw genuine fear in her daughter's eyes. Sarah had built her entire strategy around Alice's supposed incapacity, had counted on being able to control the narrative of her recovery. Now she was facing a woman who was clearly competent, clearly aware, and clearly not going to cooperate with plans for her demise. "Mother, you're not thinking clearly," Sarah tried again. "The stroke has affected your judgment. You need professional care, managed recovery, supervised." "I need my family to stop planning my funeral while I'm still alive," Alice interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I need my eldest son to stop stealing from my accounts. I need my daughter-in-law to stop inventorying my jewelry. And I need my daughter to remember that her job is to heal, not to hasten death." Sarah's face went white. "I don't know what you think you heard, but—" "I heard everything," Alice said quietly. "Every word, every plan, every calculation about how my death would solve your problems." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Sarah stood frozen, her medical bag clutched in her hands, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. "Christmas is 10 days away," Alice continued, her voice as cold as winter wind. "I suggest you use that time to think about what kind of person you want to be when we gather around my table, because I assure you, I will be there, very much alive, very much aware, and very much interested in seeing how my family chooses to celebrate." Sarah left without another word, her departure marked by the slam of the front door and the screech of tires on pavement. Alice watched from the window as her daughter's car disappeared down the street, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. Elena appeared at her elbow. "The Christmas decorations, Signora. Should I put them up now?" Alice smiled, the expression cold and calculating. Yes, Elena. Let's make this Christmas unforgettable. As evening approached, Alice felt the satisfaction of a plan well executed. Her children's carefully constructed lives were beginning to unravel, their assumptions about her death proving spectacularly wrong. But this was just the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come. Christmas was 9 days away. Alice Poole intended to make it a celebration they would never forget. Christmas was 9 days away. Alice Poole intended to make it a celebration they would never forget. The next morning brought news that filled Alice with dark satisfaction. Elena arrived with updates that painted a picture of her family's world collapsing in spectacular fashion. Mr. David's office called, Elena reported, her voice carefully neutral. His secretary said he won't be available for several days. Something about, quote, legal complications. Alice nodded grimly. Vincent Torino wasn't the type of creditor who accepted excuses gracefully. David's forged authorizations and fraudulent loans would have consequences that extended far beyond financial embarrassment. And Dr. Sarah? Her hospital privileges have been suspended pending investigation, Elena said, unable to hide her satisfaction. The board received multiple complaints about her treatment of elderly patients, her decision-making processes, her ethical standards. Alice felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Sarah had spent years building her reputation as a skilled surgeon, but professional ethics were non-negotiable in the medical field. The investigation would be thorough, public, and devastating to her career. The afternoon brought Tommy's arrival, his usual artistic confidence replaced by desperate anxiety. He moved through the house like a man walking through quicksand, his eyes darting nervously, as if expecting catastrophe to strike at any moment. "Mom," he said, settling heavily into the chair beside her bed. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Alice waited, allowing him to struggle with whatever burden he carried. "David's been arrested," Tommy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about fraud, forgery, theft. And Sarah? Her medical license is under review. Linda's been crying for hours about some social disaster at the country club." Alice maintained her careful expression of confusion and concern. "I don't understand, Tommy. What does this have to do with me?" "That's just it," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "I think it has everything to do with you. David was so sure about your prognosis. He made financial decisions based on expectations that seemed to have been wrong. And Sarah was talking about your care in ways that sounded." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Sounded like what?" Alice prompted gently. "Like she wanted you to die," Tommy whispered. "Like she was planning for it, hoping for it. And I went along with it because I'm weak, because I needed money, because I thought." Alice watched her youngest son crumble, saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. Unlike David's calculating cruelty or Sarah's clinical detachment, Tommy's betrayal had come from weakness rather than malice. "Tommy," she said quietly, "what do you want to tell me?" "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mom. We heard you were dying, and instead of grieving, we started planning how to spend your money. Instead of hoping you'd recover, we hoped you'd die quickly so we wouldn't have to deal with the burden of caring for you." Alice felt something crack in her chest. Not the brittle breaking of betrayal, but the first warm stirring of potential forgiveness. Tommy's confession was genuine, his remorse authentic. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Tommy continued. "None of us do. But I need you to know that not all of us are lost. Jessica loves you. The baby, your grandchild. They represent something better than what we've become." Alice reached out with her good hand, touching Tommy's fingers. "And you, Tommy? What do you represent?" "I don't know," he whispered, "but I want to find out. I want to be better than I've been. I want to deserve the love you've given me." Alice smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd felt toward any of her children since her stroke. "Then we'll find out together." As Tommy left, Alice felt a shift in her strategy. Her revenge would be surgical, precise. She would destroy those who had celebrated her suffering, but she would spare those who showed genuine remorse. Christmas was 8 days away. For Tommy and Jessica, it might bring redemption. For David and Sarah, it would bring reckoning. Christmas was 8 days away. For Tommy and Jessica, it might bring redemption. For David and Sarah, it would bring reckoning. Alice spent the intervening days carefully preparing for what would be the most important performance of her life. Not the facade of weakness she had maintained since her stroke, but the revelation of her true strength to a family that had underestimated her capacity for both love and vengeance. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp winter clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Alice had Elena prepare the house exactly as she had envisioned. The dining room set with her grandmother's china. The Christmas tree decorated with ornaments that told the story of 4 decades of family celebrations. The table laden with the same traditional feast she had been preparing when her stroke occurred. But this Christmas Eve dinner would be different from any that had come before. David arrived first, his usual confidence replaced by the desperate bravado of a man whose world was collapsing. The fraud charges had been filed, his assets frozen, his business partnerships dissolved. He moved through Alice's house like a man walking through the ruins of his own life, his eyes darting nervously between the elegant surroundings and the mother he had counted on dying. "Mom," he said, settling into his usual chair with forced casualness. "You look stronger. Better than I expected." Alice smiled, the expression warm and maternal. "I feel wonderful, David. Better than I have in years." Sarah arrived next, her usual clinical composure shattered by the medical board investigation that was systematically dismantling her career. The woman who had prioritized professional success over family relationships now faced the loss of everything she had worked to achieve. "Mother," Sarah said stiffly, her voice carrying the formal distance she had always maintained. "I trust you're comfortable." "More than comfortable," Alice replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm thriving." Linda swept in wearing her country club finest, but the diamond jewelry couldn't hide the social humiliation that had followed her premature celebration of Alice's death. The woman who had built her identity on appearances now faced the whispered gossip of a community that had witnessed her spectacular miscalculation. "Alice, darling," Linda said, her voice pitched with false warmth. "You look absolutely radiant. We've been so worried about you." Alice's smile turned cold. "Have you? How thoughtful." Tommy arrived last with Jessica, his face showing the strain of the past week, but also something Alice hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse and the beginning of moral courage. Jessica's presence filled the room with the kind of authentic warmth that had been missing from family gatherings for too long. As they gathered around the table, Alice felt the weight of the moment. This was her stage, her opportunity to reveal the truth about what she had learned, what she had done, and what she intended to do next. "Before we begin," Alice said, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room, "I want to thank you all for coming, especially considering how difficult this time has been for some of you." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah's clinical mask slipped slightly. Linda's smile became more forced. "I know you've all been concerned about my recovery," Alice continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "About my ability to think clearly, to make sound decisions, to understand what's happening around me." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "I want to assure you that my mind is perfectly clear. In fact, it's been clear since the moment I heard you celebrating my stroke in my hospital room." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went white. Sarah's carefully maintained composure cracked. Linda's forced smile disappeared entirely. "You see," Alice continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years building and protecting her family's future, "I heard everything. Every word about how my death would solve your problems. Every calculation about my estate. Every cruel joke about my condition being a quote-quote blessing in disguise." Tommy's face crumpled with genuine shame. Jessica reached for his hand, her own expression showing the pain of witnessing her husband's family's betrayal. "I know about the forged signatures, David," Alice said, her voice cold as winter wind. I know about the loans you took against my death. I know about the creditors who were so eager to help you spend your inheritance." David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his usual manipulation tactics failing him for the first time in his life. "I know about your plans to challenge my will, Sarah," Alice continued, "about your attempts to document my cognitive decline, about your willingness to let your own mother die rather than face the inconvenience of her recovery." Sarah's clinical detachment shattered completely. "Mother, you don't understand the medical complexities." "I understand that you took an oath to preserve life," Alice interrupted. "And you were prepared to sacrifice mine for your convenience." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft sound of Jessica's quiet crying. "But here's what you didn't understand," Alice said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her fury. "You underestimated me. You saw an aging woman and assumed weakness. You saw a stroke victim and assumed helplessness. You saw a mother's love and assumed it would always be unconditional." She stood from her chair, her movements steady and strong, abandoning the pretense of frailty that had protected her for weeks. "I have spent the past month systematically dismantling the lives of those who celebrated my suffering," Alice said, her voice deadly calm. "David, your creditors know you're alive and your loans are void. Sarah, the medical board has received detailed reports about your ethical violations. Linda, your social circle knows exactly what kind of woman you are." The faces around the table showed varying degrees of shock, fear, and dawning understanding. "You wanted me dead," Alice continued. "You planned for my death. You celebrated my stroke as a solution to your problems. So I decided to give you exactly what you deserved, the consequences of your choices." The silence stretched until Jessica's voice cut through it, barely above a whisper. "Alice, the baby, the stress." Alice's expression softened immediately, her maternal instincts overriding her anger. "Jessica, sweetheart, sit down. You shouldn't be standing." But Jessica was already doubling over, her face contorting with pain, her hand pressed to her swollen belly. "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong. The baby's coming." In that moment, Alice's carefully orchestrated revenge became secondary to protecting the innocent life that hung in the balance. As her family erupted into chaos, as Tommy frantically called for an ambulance, as the Christmas Eve dinner she had planned for weeks dissolved into crisis, Alice realized that her choices had consequences she hadn't anticipated. The game had changed. And this time, the stakes were higher than revenge. They were about the future of her family, the life of her grandchild, and the question of whether love could triumph over the cycle of betrayal she had helped create. Christmas Eve was turning into something none of them had planned. The real reckoning was just beginning. Christmas Eve was turning into something none of them had planned. The real reckoning was just beginning. The elegant Christmas dinner Alice had orchestrated as the stage for her revenge dissolved into chaos as Jessica doubled over in pain, her face contorting with the unmistakable signs of premature labor. "Call 911, Alice commanded, her voice cutting through the panic with the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. The woman who had just been delivering calculated vengeance transformed instantly into the protective matriarch her family had always needed, but never appreciated. Tommy fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. "Yes, we need an ambulance. My wife is in labor. She's only 7 months pregnant. Something's wrong." Alice moved to Jessica's side, with surprising agility, her supposed frailty forgotten in the face of genuine emergency. "Jessica, sweetheart, breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's right." David stood frozen in the doorway, his usual take-charge demeanor shattered by the collapse of his world and the immediate crisis. Sarah's medical training kicked in, but her hands trembled as she approached Jessica. The investigation into her ethics had shaken her confidence in her own professional judgment. "We need to get her lying down," Sarah said, her voice struggling to find its clinical authority. "Elevate her feet. Keep her calm." "Don't touch her," Alice said sharply, her voice carrying decades of accumulated anger. "You've done enough damage to this family." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stepped back, her face crumpling as she realized that her mother's revenge had cost her not just her career, but her right to help in a medical emergency. Linda stood against the wall, her usual social composure completely shattered. The woman who had spent the evening being systematically humiliated now faced the reality that her callous behavior had contributed to a crisis that threatened the life of her husband's grandchild. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency filling the dining room with urgency. Alice watched as they assessed Jessica's condition, their faces showing the kind of grave concern that comes with premature labor complications. "Mrs. Poole?" the lead paramedic asked, recognizing Alice from her recent hospitalization. "Are you family?" "I'm her grandmother-in-law," Alice replied, the term carrying weight she had never felt before. "And I'm riding with her to the hospital." "Ma'am, given your recent stroke—" "I'm perfectly fine," Alice interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. "And that young woman needs someone who loves her unconditionally. I'm going with her." The ambulance ride to Hartford Hospital was a blur of medical equipment, urgent radio chatter, and Jessica's labored breathing. Alice held her daughter-in-law's hand, offering the kind of steady, unconditional support she had once given freely to her own children. "Alice," Jessica whispered, her voice weak but urgent, "the baby, if something happens to me—" "Nothing is going to happen to you," Alice said firmly. "You're strong, the baby is strong, and we're going to get through this together." "But if it does," Jessica insisted, her grip tightening on Alice's hand. "Promise me you won't let this destroy what's left of the family. Promise me you'll find a way to forgive them." Alice felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the first tears she had shed since her stroke. "Jessica, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." "Promise me," Jessica repeated, her voice growing weaker. "The baby will need a family. A real family. Not one torn apart by revenge." Alice stared into the young woman's eyes, seeing the kind of moral courage that had been missing from her own children's character. Jessica was asking her to choose between justice and mercy, between the satisfaction of completed revenge and the possibility of family redemption. "I promise," Alice whispered, the words coming from somewhere deeper than her anger, deeper than her betrayal. "I promise I'll find a way." At the hospital, Alice found herself in the surreal position of being back in the same building where she had overheard her family's betrayal, but now fighting for the life that represented their future. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as the obstetrics team took over Jessica's care. Dr. Martinez, no relation to Bobby, her physical therapist, emerged from the delivery room with the kind of expression that made Alice's heart stop. "The baby is in distress," he explained. "We need to perform an emergency C-section. The next few hours are critical for both mother and child." Alice sank into a waiting room chair, the weight of her choices suddenly crushing. Her revenge had been perfect, surgical, designed to make her family pay for their betrayal. But now that calculated vengeance threatened to destroy the very thing she had always fought to protect, the future of her family. Tommy paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his face haggard with guilt and fear. "This is my fault," he kept repeating. "If I hadn't been so weak, if I hadn't gone along with their plans." "Stop," Alice said quietly. "Guilt won't help Jessica or the baby now." David sat slumped in a corner chair, his usual arrogance replaced by the hollow look of a man who had lost everything. The fraud charges, the frozen assets, the collapsed business relationships, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the life hanging in the balance. Sarah stood by the window, her clinical training warring with her personal devastation. The medical board investigation had stripped away her professional identity, but watching Jessica fight for her life forced her to confront what she had truly lost: her humanity, her capacity for unconditional love, her relationship with the mother who had sacrificed everything for her. Bobby Martinez appeared in the waiting room, having heard about the emergency through the hospital network. His presence was a reminder of the person Alice had been during her recovery, someone focused on healing rather than revenge. "Mrs. Poole," he said gently, settling into the chair beside her. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," Alice admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought they deserved to pay for what they did to me." "Maybe they did," Bobby said quietly. "But now you have to decide what kind of person you want to be going forward. What kind of grandmother you want to be to that baby." Alice looked around the waiting room at her broken family. David, destroyed by his own greed and desperation. Sarah, facing the collapse of everything she had built her identity around. Tommy, genuinely remorseful but paralyzed by guilt. Linda, finally understanding the cost of her callous ambition. They were all paying for their choices, just as she had planned. But the price was higher than she had anticipated, not just for them, but for the innocent life now fighting to survive. Elena appeared in the waiting room, having rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. Her presence was a comfort, a reminder of the loyalty and love that still existed in Alice's world. "Señora," Elena said softly, "whatever you decide, I will support you. But that baby needs a family. A real family." Alice closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Jessica's promise, the responsibility of choice. She had spent months planning her revenge, had executed it with surgical precision, had watched her children's lives crumble exactly as she had intended. But now she faced a different kind of choice, one that would define not just her own future, but the future of her grandchild. The hospital intercom crackled with routine announcements, but Alice barely heard them. She was calculating a different kind of strategy now, not one designed to destroy, but one meant to rebuild. Not revenge, but redemption. Not justice, but mercy. The operating room doors remained closed, Jessica's life hanging in the balance. Alice realized that her next decision would determine whether her family had a future worth fighting for, or whether her perfectly executed revenge would destroy everything she had ever truly loved. Christmas Day was only hours away. It would either mark the end of the Poole family as she had known it, or the beginning of something entirely new. A family built on truth, accountability, and the kind of love that could survive even the deepest betrayal. The choice was hers to make. The choice was hers to make. Alice sat in the hospital waiting room as Christmas Day dawned gray and uncertain, her family scattered around her like survivors of a shipwreck. The elegant revenge she had orchestrated now seemed hollow in the face of Jessica's fight for life, her grandchild's struggle to survive. At 6:17 a.m. on Christmas morning, Dr. Martinez emerged from the operating room with the kind of smile that transforms everything. "Both mother and baby are stable," he announced, his voice carrying the joy that comes with preserving life against difficult odds. "You have a granddaughter, Mrs. Poole. She's small, just over 3 pounds, but she's fighting." Alice felt her knees buckle with relief. Tommy collapsed into a chair, his face wet with tears. Even David and Sarah seemed to remember what it meant to feel something beyond self-interest. "Can we see them?" Alice asked, her voice barely steady. "One at a time for now," Dr. Martinez replied. "The baby needs to stay in the NICU for observation, but Jessica is asking for you." Alice found Jessica in the recovery room, pale but alert, her eyes bright with the exhaustion and triumph of new motherhood. The young woman who had been the moral center of their broken family now looked fragile but determined. "She's beautiful," Jessica whispered, her voice hoarse from the surgery. "Tiny, but perfect. I want to name her Grace." Grace. Alice felt tears slide down her cheeks. In the midst of their family's disgrace, Jessica had chosen to name her daughter after the thing they all needed most: unmerited favor, forgiveness, redemption. "Jessica," Alice said, taking her daughter-in-law's hand, "I'm so sorry. My revenge, my anger, it put you and the baby at risk. I nearly destroyed the very thing I was trying to protect." Jessica squeezed her hand weakly. "You were hurt, betrayed. I understand why you did what you did, but now we have a chance to build something better." "I don't know if that's possible," Alice admitted. "The damage I've done, the things I've set in motion." "It's possible," Jessica said firmly, "but it requires something harder than revenge. It requires forgiveness. And it requires accountability. Real accountability, not just punishment." Alice spent the next hour holding her granddaughter for the first time, marveling at the tiny fingers, the perfect features, the steady breathing that represented hope incarnate. Grace was smaller than she should be, more fragile than any newborn should have to be, but she was alive, fighting, growing stronger with each breath. Over the following days, Alice made a series of decisions that would reshape her family's future. She called James Morrison to her bedside, not her hospital bed this time, but the chair beside Grace's incubator, and outlined a new plan. "I want to modify the will again," she told him. "Not to punish, but to create accountability." The new will was complex, designed not just to distribute wealth, but to rebuild character. David would receive a trust fund, not the lump sum he had expected, but a managed income that required him to work, to contribute, to prove his worth through actions rather than inheritance. The fraud charges would be resolved through restitution and community service, his debts paid, but his comfortable assumptions about unearned wealth shattered forever. Sarah's inheritance came with conditions that reflected her profession's highest ideals. A significant portion would fund a clinic for elderly patients, staffed by doctors who understood that healing meant more than clinical efficiency. Sarah would oversee the clinic, her medical license restored contingent on her commitment to the kind of compassionate care she had failed to show her own mother. Linda's portion of the estate was redirected entirely, not to her, but to a scholarship fund for young women from modest backgrounds seeking higher education. The woman who had married for money and social status would watch her husband's inheritance help others achieve through merit what she had always sought through manipulation. Tommy's inheritance was the most complex. Half would go into a trust for Grace, ensuring the baby's future regardless of her parents' choices. The other half would support Tommy's art, but with conditions. He would teach art therapy to stroke patients, would use his creativity to help others heal from the kind of trauma Alice had experienced. "And Jessica?" James asked, reviewing the intricate document. "Jessica gets the house," Alice said firmly, "and a trust fund that ensures she never has to depend on anyone for her security or Grace's future. She's the only one who understood what family really means." The most difficult conversation came on New Year's Eve, when Alice gathered her family in the NICU waiting room. Grace was stronger now, breathing on her own, her tiny hand grasping Alice's finger with surprising strength. "I want to tell you about forgiveness," Alice began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced the worst and chosen to rise above it. "Not because you deserve it, but because Grace does. Because she needs a family, not a collection of broken people consumed by guilt and resentment." David looked up from his hands, his face showing the kind of humility that comes only from complete defeat. "Mom, I know I can't undo what I did. The stealing, the lying, the way I counted on your death." "No, you can't undo it," Alice agreed. "But you can choose who you become from this moment forward. You can choose to be the kind of man your daughter can be proud of." Sarah's clinical composure had been replaced by something Alice hadn't seen in years: genuine emotion. "I violated everything I swore to uphold," she said quietly. "I prioritized my convenience over your life. I don't know how to live with that." "By dedicating your life to making sure no other family faces what we've faced," Alice replied. "By remembering that every patient is someone's mother, someone's beloved family member." Tommy held Jessica's hand, his eyes never leaving Grace's tiny form. "I want to be better," he said simply. "For her, for Jessica, for you." "Then be better," Alice said. "All of you. Choose to be better." Linda sat silent for a long moment before speaking. "I've spent my whole life trying to be someone I'm not," she admitted. "Trying to buy respect, to climb social ladders, to matter through association rather than achievement. I don't know who I am without that." "Then this is your chance to find out," Alice said. "To discover who Linda Poole really is when she's not performing for an audience." As the family sat together in the NICU, watching Grace sleep peacefully in her incubator, Alice felt a profound shift in the fabric of their relationships. The revenge she had planned had been necessary, not for its own sake, but because it had forced them all to confront the truth about who they had become. But revenge alone would have left them broken, scattered, unable to heal. It was the choice to move beyond revenge, to demand accountability while offering redemption, that created the possibility of genuine transformation. Grace stirred in her incubator, her tiny eyes opening to look at the faces surrounding her. Alice saw her family through her granddaughter's eyes, not as the people they had been, but as the people they could become. "Happy New Year, Grace," Alice whispered, her voice filled with hope she hadn't felt in months. "You're going to grow up in a family that knows the difference between love and obligation, between forgiveness and enabling, between justice and mercy." Alice Poole had survived her stroke, executed her revenge, and chosen redemption over destruction. Her family would never be the same. They would be better, stronger, more honest than they had ever been before. The monitors in the NICU beeped steadily, marking time not toward an ending, but toward a beginning built on truth, accountability, and the kind of love that could survive even the deepest betrayal. Alice had taught her family their most important lesson, that sometimes the greatest act of love is holding people accountable for their choices while still believing in their capacity to change. Grace's future was secure, surrounded by a family that had learned to love without conditions, to forgive without forgetting, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of their collective mistakes. The last Thanksgiving had ended with betrayal and stroke. The first Christmas of their new beginning started with life, hope, and the promise of redemption earned through genuine transformation. Alice Poole had won the most important victory of all, not over her family, but for them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,